Before I actually introduce Sir V.S. Naipaul, Vidya Naipaul, I'll acknowledge my own debt of gratitude. And that's, I think, me and many writers like me actually learned how to use the English language with power, with precision, with eloquence by reading V.S. Naipaul. We didn't know him, we read him. I remember as a college student, I read every single book he'd written till then, which even then was an over close to 15 novels. Just to give you an idea of the scale of Vidya Naipaul's achievement, before he was 30, he had written and published 4 novels, and those 4 novels included what is considered one of the masterpieces of 20th century literature, A House for Mr. Biswas. By the time he was 45, he had written 15 books, and he had already won pretty much every prize that there was to win in the English-speaking world. I remember once speaking to him many years ago, and he said that till he was 45, he continued to live in an age of, in a state of great financial anxiety about the writing. I want to put that in perspective in a time when writers write a single book and expect to earn crores of rupees, that by that time, by the time he was 45, V.S. Naipaul would have written 15 books, would have written and published 15 books. As I said earlier, I think there's, at least in the post-colonial world of writers, at least among Indian writers for certain, I don't think there's a single Indian writer who can say with any honesty that he does not owe a debt to V.S. Naipaul. V.S. Naipaul is the pioneer among post-colonial writers. He came to England in 1952 on a scholarship from Trinidad. He was just 18 years old. And he finished at Oxford, and maybe he'll talk a little bit about that experience, a very mixed experience. And then he began to write. And by the time, as I told you, by the time he was 30, he had written 4 books, including A House for Mr. Biswas. When he won the Nobel Prize in 2001, the Nobel Prize for Literature, and by the way, just as a small aside, I want to tell you that he was in the running for the Nobel Prize from 1973 onwards. So, I mean, from the time he was 42 years old, he was in the running for the prize. He finally won the prize in 2001, and the jury at that point said several important things about his work. And I think the most important thing about his work, which anybody who reads him and follows him closely, and does not just follow news reports and Google reports, knows, is that there is a kind of intensity and an intelligence and an integrity to the writing of V.S. Naipaul, which is fairly unique among the writers of the last 50 or 75 years. He's been called the writer's writer. That does not mean that he uses unintelligible words or polysyllabic words. Actually, when you read V.S. Naipaul, it's like it's almost a testament in what looks like very, very plain, clear, simple writing. But that writing deals with subjects of immense complexity. And I think when they call him a writer's writer, what they try and say is that even writers read V.S. Naipaul to understand how to convey very complex ideas in very, very lucid prose. And I encourage everyone here who wishes to understand not just what he writes about, but just how English is used, to read him. I still do that, and even now when I do that, I'm taken aback by the sheer quality, the sheer virtuosity of the prose. And as I said, you'll rarely stumble across a big word in the writing. I'm going to try and actually extract from Vidya Naipaul some thoughts about writing. I think and that's what universally we're all interested in the art of fiction, the art of nonfiction, the future of these genres, the future of long-form writing, and maybe, if we still have the time, a little bit about his oeuvre in India. Vidya, can we start? First of all, I just want you to tell us a little bit about the journey of discovering the writing, about finding the voice. I mean, how did you, coming from Trinidad in the early 1950s, when it was when there was no such thing as a colonial writer in the English language, how did you arrive at the material, and how did you arrive at a voice that allowed you to deal with that material?
Well, I suppose it was, one reason would be that I didn't know about that problem. I just wanted to write the books. And out of writing the books came an understanding of the material itself, and then later the other side of things. How to go on, especially, is quite a problem. You mentioned earlier how many people have just written one book or two books and then, as it were, fall silent. I was very worried about that happening to me. I remember after I'd done a very big book, which was in 1961, and when I was, as it were, coming to India for the first time, I had a panic about that very thing, about not being able to go on. And it took the concrete form of feeling that I was losing my voice, that I was losing the gift of speech. It's a terrible thing. But it was, as it were, that concrete expression of the deep disturbance. The disturbance being, can I go on? How can I go on? Because to be a writer, you just don't write the one book. Although many people write a bit like that. You write, you have the success, and that's it. But the thing is, if you're a writer, you do the one book, and then you have to go on and do the second, and then the third, and it never ends. At the age of nearly 80, I'm still tormented by this need to go on a little bit. So perhaps a lot of the discoveries about the nature of writing came to me from this need to go on. Is that clear to you? Does that make sense to you?
You once said with it that you were driven by the idea of writing as a noble vocation. The first impulse that drove you to writing largely sucked out of your own father's idea of the idea of writing was the idea of it as a noble vocation. As you kept writing, I just want to tell you that as of now, with Naipaul's oeuvre consists of 30 books. That's pretty much what 10 writers would write in a lifetime. So it's 30 books, a mix of 15 fictions and 15 non-fictions. Did you, as you kept writing, figure that it was something else, or was it always, and is it even today, the idea of nobility as a vocation that underpins the writing?
Well, I suppose things would always change. Nothing stays the same. And I have to say that it's modified now. The idea of nobility has been subsumed, to use that word, in the idea of going on, writing the next book and the next book and the next book. But to write the next book always means you have to dig deep in yourself to find this material. You have to dig deep in yourself to come up with what is correct and true to you and true to the material. And well, I have believed in the idea of the nobility of writing. And it's for the reader to judge whether I have succeeded. Some readers I know will feel that I have run the side down, run down the wicked politicians here and there. But the writing has to stand on its own. It has to be judged. It has to be judged for its moral quality. Moral quality in this sense. When you look at the world, you look at it without prejudice. You look at it seeking to find out the essence of any situation rather than going for the quick view, the quick fix. Does that deal with a little bit with your...
There are two things, Vidya, that I've always marked about the writing. One is, it very seldom is suffused with second-hand opinion. Most of the material, at least in the non-fiction, it comes from a place that you try to excavate yourself.
Yes.
You know. And the second is, there's this kind of absence of ideological baggage that you bring to your inquiry. And the inquiry is almost, if I may say so, because writers can't be that, but it's almost scientific in its approach, that it addresses the material with a minimal baggage. Now, is this something you have had to train yourself to do, or is this something that came naturally? And how much store would you set by it even now? In a world that has become obsessed with the idea of managing image, managing ego,
yes.
managing constructs of identity, you know.
Yes.
In a minefield like that,
yes.
how does a writer, wishing to get to the heart of the thing, heart of anything, how does he proceed?
Well, again, I would say it's practice. You see, I turned to nonfiction quite early. The primary impulse was being asked to make a journey by the Prime Minister of Trinidad, a journey in the Caribbean and British South America, to have a look at the slave societies as they had once been, to see what had happened to them. And I was so excited by the idea of free travel that I agreed and didn't understand until I was deep in the writing later that writing a book of nonfiction was really quite different from working out a fictional work.
We are referring here to the middle passage, which is his fifth book and the first book of nonfiction, right?
That's it, yes, yes, yes. See, you could travel, and then what you would do at a simple level, you could do, let's suppose there was a paper in London that wanted you to travel and to come up very quickly with something about Bolivia. Now, what you could do to do that very quickly was to take an airplane to Bolivia, put up at a hotel, and then find out about the English language paper. I'm sure there is one in Bolivia. And then you go and see the editor of that paper, get the views, and you distill them in a piece and send it back. And it comes out in a few days, and it all reads very profoundly. But the other way, then you go and you put up at the hotel, and you live the hotel life for a bit, and you meet people, you have dinner with them, you talk about this and that, because at that stage one is not trained. One doesn't know how to make proper inquiries. All these things have to be learned. And then you discover, when you take your notes back, that you can't make a book out of dining with people and meeting them and having drinks with them. You need some other, there's got to be some other cement. So that's one way you learn how to write the nonfiction book. And the other way, as I told you, is the simple one. And then if you don't know about a place, I was very fortunate in this way. I believed to be a good traveler, one shouldn't read the books beforehand, the books about the place. I think you should go blank and let the place have an impact on you. And out of that impact, you must try to dissect the various angles and motifs. So once you start doing that, you begin to learn how to do it. When I went to South America, for the first time, properly doing a piece, or doing a big article.
Oliver Perron. Oliver Perron?
That's it, yes,
Oliver Perron.
yes. I spent about 6 weeks trying to find out about everything. I read the papers very carefully. I read even the classified advertisements. They would help you to understand a little bit the society you were in. And then I spoke to a few politicians, but very few, very few. No point in talking to politicians all the time because their views are simple, representing a party view, and that is not what the writer has to do. The writer has to get a profounder, broader, more rounded view. So that was how I learned to do it. This very slow approach, this very careful, studied approach, and in fact carrying the material mainly in one's head. And that's how it began. I don't know whether this is clear to people, what I'm saying. Tarun, do you think it's clear a little bit?
It's clear. It's clear to me, Vidya. If you will, Vidya, will you just initiate us into the process of the non-fiction books? Because I can tell you, since I happen to have known him for the last 15, 16 years, he is easily the best listener I've known in my life, bar none. I mean, I have seen him just sit socially and only ask questions and listen for hours on end. So he's actually the best listener I've ever met. What I'd love him to tell us is a little bit about the process of the non-fiction books. I mean, how is the material gathered and how is the material then somehow made true? I mean, how do you arrive at true material and render it truly then? You know, a little bit of the whole process of how you meet people and how you mine them for the material that you seek.
Yes, yeah. Well, this is such a matter of luck, the meeting. You've got to have initial contact. You've got to have X, Y, or Z. You can go and see. But you mustn't depend on them for everything. They'll just put you in touch with people. And then there are these other people who will start talking. And what I did something very practical, which I can talk about, not betraying any secrets. I had 2 small notebooks. I had one which I put in my top breast pocket, and then I had another in the side pocket. And the one that people saw was the one in my side pocket. And I'd begin to talk to someone, and then I would not make notes. That came later. I would talk, and if I found it interesting what is being said to me, I would tell the person, I'm very interested in what you're saying, but I haven't made any notes. I'd like to come back and talk to you again about what we have just been talking about. And what would happen at that second going over the material, I'd be writing it in longhand, because I don't have shorthand, and I don't have a tape recorder. And I would be writing in this slow way, and the person I'm talking to would respond to my writing in this painful longhand. And he or she would begin to talk more slowly. And interestingly, although it was artificial, that level, everything in that meeting would later have a feeling of actuality. It would sound real. It would sound as though the person was actually talking for the first time. So that was the one thing I learned to do. But you know, I can't tell you more because there are other things you have to pick up yourself. You have to know when a person is interesting. You have to know that you can judge that only for yourself. And then whether what was being said was true, whether it was profound. And then you have to have something in your head about writing for periods ahead. You have to feel that what you are writing or getting material for today will be of interest in 20 years or 30 years. And if you fix it like that in your head, it helps you to gauge what is important and what is not important. So because of this, I go around really thinking, is this important? Will this last? What will this sound like, not only next week or in 5 years, but in 20 years or 30 years? If I'm reading a book about the period, would I pick up this statement? Would it make sense to me? So there are all kinds of judgments which you are constantly making. And that's why I say it's not easy to give you many tips about how you go about doing this kind of work. Just a few clues. And you see, all that I'm saying is you have to trust your intuition, you have to trust your moral judgment, you have to be on the lookout for it.
Vidya, you had written close to 11 or 12 books of fiction, with the last, at that point, the last being A Bend in the River in 1979, before you made a break from fiction, and at that point in time you felt that fiction could no longer work for you, and you needed to adopt other modes of writing.
Yes.
And of course the modes of writing came with Enigma of Arrival. Before that, Finding the Center,
yes,
which had those two gorgeous essays, loosely connected. Then came the Enigma of Arrival,
yes,
and then came Away in the World,
yes,
all of which bend the genre,
yes,
which kind of accommodated the idea of history, of autobiography, of reimagining the past and the future,
yes,
and somehow constructing a cohesive narrative or full of resonances,
yes,
you know.
Yes.
What was it that led you from what one imagines is the obvious and visceral power of literary fiction to struggling with these modes of non-fiction? What was it?
At a very early stage, I felt that I was coming to an end of the material I carried within me. By that I mean the childhood stuff, the stuff of the landscape I was born in and got to know. And I felt that in order to go on to be a writer, because I wanted to be a writer, I just didn't want to write one book. I wanted to be a writer, I wanted to do a series of books. I wanted to have my name under lots of books on the shelf. I realized then that I would have to do something else. And that was when, very seriously, I turned to nonfiction. Because that, I felt, could take me on. It wasn't easy. I felt, with the ignorance of not knowing about something, that nonfiction gave you the material ready-made, and you just transferred it to the pages of a book. It wasn't like that. It had its own rules. As I said before, you can't make a book out of just having dinner with people and lunching with people. You have to do something else with the material. But essentially, my urge to it came from this old idea of wishing to go on, needing to go on, not wishing, needing to go on, to be a writer, to go on. Because if I didn't go on, I wouldn't be a writer.
Vidya, let's just quickly talk a little bit about the three India books. The first one, you travel in 1962 and you write An Area of Darkness, published 1964, Howls of Outrage in India, great acclaim for the quality of the work in the rest of the world. You travel again in 1975 and you write the India Wounded Civilization, comes out in 77. I can see Sudhir Kakkar sitting there. He features in the book. You talk to him, he's in there in the book. It's a book that looks at the past. It looks at what disrupted the past. Just like An Area of Darkness examines the experiential narrative of yours, of returning to your homeland. And then comes 1989, A Million Mutinies Now, which is remarkable. Remarkable, I say, because in 1988 and 89, when you were traveling for the book, I was a young journalist, I remember, nobody in this country could see the coming efflorescence. Nobody could see that something was going to dramatically change on the landscape. I remember the issues we were embedded in. I remember the little battles we were fighting here. We had no sense that in the next 10, 15 years, this country was going to explode into the global consciousness in the way it has. Nobody saw it. You saw it in 89 and you wrote about it. I just want you to just tell us a little bit about the three books and what was the experience of each book, you know, and does that still hold fast and true for you, the experience of the books and what you discovered then?
Yes, people might be tempted to feel that they are stages, the books are stages in the life of the country. They're actually stages in the life of the writer. You see, if you write one book and then you go back to look at the same place, which has very roughly the same kind of material, the temptation is strong to repeat. But I've never liked repeating, so I've always tried to go on and do something else. So, some reviewers who said, "Hello, what's happened to the India of the first book? Where has all the unpleasantness gone to?" I'll have to say, well, you know, I did that. I can't do it again. And if you want to go back to that, it's your privilege to go back to the early book. The early book is always there. I've been very fortunate that way. The books don't die, you know. They're around. And that first book about India will soon be 50 years old. Here's Tarun talking about it as though it came out 5 years ago. But it hasn't. It's half a lifetime ago, or more than almost a lifetime ago. So these are books now which you don't criticize or review, because they're books which have acquired a life of their own simply by lasting. They're not to be defended or criticized any longer, except in a profound way.
Tell us a bit about A Million Mutinies Now, with the experience of writing that book, of spotting that India was about to change in a huge way. What gave you a clear sense of that?
Little things like seeing that the people I knew, they had servants whose children were being educated. And so if you went into one particular family, you saw a generation or two coming along. That was at a very simple level what would be there. And then you must understand too that there's this great thing about education. If people are being educated, it has a cumulative effect. It doesn't occur right away, but it builds up, and there we are. And I saw it. The other thing is that I said there are stages in a man's life, the writer's life. The books, they're not stages in the life of a country. And by that I mean that when I'm writing about, even writing about India, I really am always writing about myself, understanding my own background, understanding what I've come from. So that has to be understood.
Once very famously, and you can correct me if I'm quoting it wrong, you said that, this is probably 30 years ago, and again very prophetic, like much of your writing has been, you said that the best talent in the future would not go to writing, but would go to cinema. Is that true? Is that what you said?
Yes, I was feeling very unhappy at the stage about not being able to go on, and rather jealous of people who were in this more exciting business of making films, you know. And I think it's possible, it is possible that writing, putting words on paper to be printed is not as important as the contemporary style of getting films out.
Would you see that as a great loss, the decline of the long-form narrative, the decline of the long-written work? Is that going to be a great loss, civilizationally?
No. The thing about literature and all the art forms that we know, is that it's part of a developing process. The novel, what you call the long form, you say began with, let's abbreviate history a little, began with Dickens in 1836 or thereabouts. And 100 years later, you couldn't write books like Dickens. You had to do other things. And I don't think anyone, not even someone in India, would want to do a Dickensian novel. I made a joke about Dickens a long time ago. I said Dickens died young. He was killed by the Dickensian novel. And it could easily happen with people from here if they wish to do the Dickensian novel.
Two last questions. I know we're running out of time. One is the first four novels are extremely humorous. There's a very strong comic element to them.
Yes.
Miguel Street, Mystic Monsieur, yes. Suffrage of Elvira, and even The House for Mr. Biswas.
Yes.
I mean, it has a very strong tone of black humor. It becomes less and less as the books go on. Is that reflective of the writer's experience of the world? Or is it that there was the comic element then became no longer a literary device that worked for you?
Well, there's comedy and comedy. The comedy of the early books, a kind of very verbal comedy. It's made in a line. There's another kind of comedy which requires time and space to be amplified. And I think that kind of comedy still exists in the later work, but you have to work harder for them.
And finally, just a last word I'd like from you. I was reading an essay on Ludwig Wittgenstein, and there was this incredible story about Wittgenstein that in 1942, during the middle of the Second World War, Wittgenstein was already by then the world's greatest living philosopher. He actually chose to work in Guy's Hospital in London, if that's how you pronounce it, as a ward boy. So he would take medicine from the dispensary and he would go and give it in the wards, yeah, where he would tell the patients not to eat it. But fundamentally, he lived with this notion, and in fact, for a long time, he was a school teacher. This was the world's greatest living philosopher. And there's a particular moment in 1942 when he meets the wife of G.E. Moore, the other British philosopher. And G.E. Moore's wife tells him she works in a jam factory. And Wittgenstein is delighted. He has not been so delighted in a long time. It's a real job. He's delighted. And he tells his students, don't go to university, don't study any more philosophy, and don't teach philosophy. Now, I know for a fact that you're constantly, including my daughters, you constantly discourage them from going to university anywhere in the world.
I did.
So what is it about the work ethic and the academic life that kind of, doesn't work for you?
I must tread very carefully here. I don't want to mislead people, but if I had to teach someone or superintend their teaching, I would be very unhappy if they decided to go to university, because it would take 10 years after that for people to become themselves. They would just well, look at that, I've touched a chord. I had no idea. But that was the point, that I've seen many, not only universities, I've seen many bright children go into the sixth form, or its equivalent, and then by dint of striving to be what their teachers and what the school wants them to be, they lose their originality, they lose their way of expressing themselves naturally, and they become mimic people. They become like people who exist in great numbers outside. I think that was the main thing I was concerned about.
And the work ethic, your obvious fascination for people who work with their hands. I've seen you in my own house get wrapped in conversation with people who work with their hands and make many inquiries. What is it about that? Is it because it's not exactly what you do, or is it something else?
No, because I'm a writer. I'm interested in everybody, and everything, and I like to get down to it as much as possible, to see, to feel the world through other people. It's something I've always done since I was a child. I tried to look at the world through the eyes of the man or woman I was with, and that took me on to later life.
Before I can close this session, I have to tell you a great story which is narrated not by Vidya Naipaul but by Paul Theroux, who writes about it in his book. Vidya Naipaul and Paul Theroux spent some time together in a Uganda campus in the mid-1960s. And there was a poetry competition organized by the university. And Vidya Naipaul was made the judge for the poetry competition. And Vidya then would have been 31 or 32 years old. So when the competition prize had to be announced, and there was a hall as big as this, and all these poets who had written these poems, they were all sitting there, the announcement was made that there was no first prize, and there was no second prize, but there was a third prize. And when the person came to take his third prize from Vidya Naipaul said, gave him the third prize and said, but before I give it to you, my friend, you have to promise me one thing. You have to promise me that you will stop writing poetry. So I mean, it's been a great, for me, it's always a great privilege to get time with him, to speak to him. It's always very illuminating. And unlike a lot of controversies that float around about things he may have said, I always tell people, read the books. Everything that V.S. Naipaul is in the books. The books are written without any blandishments. The books are written without any real prejudices. The books are written without checkbooks, without second-guessing publishers. And I can tell you, there are very few writers working in the contemporary world, and I know way too many of them, far more than any sane man should. There are very few writers working who have the integrity to the art form that V.S. Naipaul has. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.